1946, Harlem KKK lynched Bumpy Johnson's nephew in Marcus Garvey Park, leaving the body where morning commuters would see it first. 7 days passed, and despite clear evidence, no arrests were made, no charges filed, and police quietly stepped aside. This was not a missed lead or a failed investigation. It was a deliberate pause in enforcement. When the law chooses silence, who is actually in control of justice? At 6:23 a.m., Marcus Garvey Park was quiet in the way. Cities are quiet before they admit what the day will become. A woman walking her dog noticed something hanging from an oak tree near the north entrance, turning slightly in the morning air. From a distance, it looked misplaced but harmless. When she stepped closer, the scream broke the stillness and carried across the grass. Police arrived at 6:47 a.m. 2 patrol cars. No sirens. The officers moved toward the tree and slowed without being told to. They already understood what they were looking at and, more importantly, what it would require of them. The body hung low enough to be unmistakable, high enough to be deliberate. Detective Robert Walsh reached the scene and stopped. He didn't approach right away. He stood back and read the layout like a sentence written for him. The tree was visible from 3 streets. The timing ensured commuters, churchgoers, and early workers would see it before noon. This wasn't concealment. This was placement. The victim was young, 19, maybe 20. Dressed neatly. A sweatshirt, pressed pants, 1 shoe missing. He looked like someone who had left home with plans and never made it back. Walsh's eyes traced the details without touching anything. Rope burns on the hands, scuffed ground beneath the tree. Signs of a struggle that had taken time. Then he saw the note. It was pinned to the chest, written in block letters that were rough but confident, short, direct, old language. The kind meant to travel fast without explanation. Walsh read it once, then again, as if repetition might soften the meaning. It didn't. The park felt staged now, like a set designed to deliver one image to an entire neighborhood. Families walked these paths every Sunday. Children played here in the afternoons. Whoever chose this location wanted Harlem to remember the tree long after the body was gone. Walsh scanned the perimeter. No crowd yet, but windows were opening. People were stopping at corners, pretending not to stare. Harlem knew how to watch without being seen. This was already becoming a shared memory forming in silence. Detective Sullivan joined him and didn't speak at first. His eyes went straight to the note, then to Walsh. In a different city at a different time, procedure would have taken over photographs canvassing questions that didn't care who felt threatened. But 1946 had its own rules, and everyone on that grass knew them. Walsh crouched near the base of the tree. Cigarette butts were scattered near by different brands, crushed into the dirt as if several men had stood there waiting. Shoe prints overlapped heavy boots, work shoes. Evidence that existed only if someone chose to see it. He reached into the victim's pocket and pulled out a wallet. For a moment, he hoped it would be empty. It wasn't. Inside was a student ID, clean and official against the dirt of the morning. Thomas Johnson. The name tightened Walsh's chest. Not because it was uncommon, but because he knew exactly where it would lead. He had heard it before, spoken carefully in precinct hallways. Sullivan leaned in. Who is he? Walsh didn't look up. Thomas Johnson, he said. Then after a beat that changed the air. We notify his uncle, Bumpy Johnson. Silence settled between them. This was no longer just a death. It was a trigger. Sullivan looked back at the body, then at the note, and finally away from the tree toward the streets beyond the park. What do we write? Sullivan asked. Walsh stood slowly. He thought about courtrooms that wouldn't convict, about witnesses who would disappear into fear, about files that closed themselves without explanation. He thought about how fast this city could decide not to know something. We write suicide, Walsh said. The word sounded wrong immediately. He met Sullivan's eyes and hardened his voice into something official. We file it, we notify the family, and then we stay out of whatever happens next. Sullivan nodded once. He didn't argue. The park remained quiet, but it wasn't calm. Somewhere in Harlem, a phone was about to ring. Somewhere else, men were about to understand that the message pinned to that body had reached exactly who it was meant for. and the city would learn what happens when a crime is committed in public, yet the first official response is to look away. The wallet was still warm from the body when Detective Walsh opened it. Inside, everything was orderly cash folded, once a transit card, a student ID pressed flat as if it mattered. The name sat there in clean print, official and unmistakable. Thomas Johnson, age 19, student, local address. Walsh didn't say it out loud at first. He read it twice, then closed the wallet as if the name might leak into the air. Around him, the park had begun to fill with a quiet audience, windows, opening footsteps, slowing people, stopping a little too long at the edge of the grass. Harlem had already started counting what this would cost. Sullivan leaned closer. "Who is he?" he asked, though the tone suggested he already knew this wasn't a routine question. Walsh answered with the name, then added the detail that mattered. The family connection. The uncle everyone in the city knew without needing an introduction. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tree creaked softly in the wind. A patrol officer shifted his weight and looked away. This was the instant when a case stops being about evidence and starts being about consequences. Walsh thought about the rulebook he'd been trained on in the city he actually worked in. In 1946, the law was clear on paper and flexible in practice. A white jury would hear a story like this and find reasons not to hear it at all. Witnesses would remember nothing. Leads would evaporate. The report would travel up the chain, get stamped, and come back thinner than it left. Sullivan broke the silence. "We've got a note," he said quietly. "We've got marks. This isn't..." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Everyone there knew what it wasn't. Walsh nodded once. He knew too. He also knew how many cases he'd seen where knowing made no difference. According to procedures used at the time, classification could be decided quickly, especially when supervisors wanted it that way. Speed was often mistaken for efficiency. In reality, it was protection. They stepped a few feet away from the tree, close enough to speak without being overheard, far enough to pretend privacy existed. Sullivan lowered his voice. "If we push this," he said, "we're pushing everything that comes with the name." Walsh stared at the ground. He pictured the precinct after the call went out, phones ringing, doors, closing orders delivered without being written down. He pictured a courtroom months later, the case reduced to fragments, the verdict decided before opening statements. He had spent 2 decades watching how justice bent when it was asked to carry more weight than the city allowed. "And if we don't?" Sullivan asked. Walsh didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the body, at the way it had been left, where no one could pretend it was hidden. He thought about the message pinned to the chest and who it was meant to reach. He understood that this wasn't just about avoiding trouble. It was about avoiding a collision no one believed the system could survive. "What do we write?" Sullivan asked again. Walsh exhaled slowly. The decision didn't feel like a choice so much as a surrender dressed up as professionalism. He reached for his notebook, already knowing it would never tell the whole story. "We write one word," he said. "Suicide." Sullivan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He had seen this before, even if never quite like this. The word would close doors before anyone could knock. It would move the case out of homicide and into a category that required fewer questions and less attention. According to the rules as they were practiced, it was allowed. Walsh wrote it down. One word. Clean. Final. They stood there for another moment, listening to the park breathe around them. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled. A superior officer would arrive soon, nod once, and approve what had already been decided. The report would move fast precisely because speed prevented reconsideration. As they walked back toward the patrol cars, Walsh understood what that name had done. It hadn't just identified the victim, it had rewritten the outcome. In this city in this year, some names didn't open investigations. They closed them. Thomas Johnson was 19 years old, and on paper his life looked exactly like the kind the system claimed it was built to protect. He was a first-year student, serious, quiet, already talking about law school. His professors described him as precise, disciplined, the type who listened more than he spoke. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He carried books the way other boys carried cigarettes. He lived with his mother, Ruth Johnson, in a modest apartment off 135th Street. His uncle Bumpy Johnson checked on him often, but Thomas was not part of that world. He avoided it deliberately. He believed in institutions. He believed that if you followed rules closely enough, the rules would eventually notice. Every Sunday morning, Thomas followed the same routine. He left the apartment shortly after 6, crossed Marcus Garvey Park, and walked to church. Same path, same timing, same coat when the weather cooled. Neighbors recognized him because predictability makes people visible, and visibility is usually considered safety. In reality, it can also become a map. Investigators later noted how clean his habits were. No deviations. No unexplained stops. No nights unaccounted for. His life ran on schedule, and schedules are easy to study if someone is paying attention long enough. Whoever took Thomas didn't need luck. They needed patience. The park wasn't chosen randomly. It was part of his routine, not a shortcut. It was public open and symbolic Harlem's green space watched, but rarely guarded. Anyone observing from a distance would have known exactly when Thomas would appear and exactly how long they had. That level of certainty doesn't come from impulse. It comes from watching. At the time, city officials insisted that racial extremism was a Southern problem, something imported through newspapers and distant trials. But internal reports told a quieter story. In northern cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, small cells operated without banners or marches. They didn't announce themselves. They blended. These groups weren't large. They didn't need to be. Their structure was simple by design: limited membership, compartmentalized roles, no written rosters. Meetings rotated locations. Names were shared sparingly. The goal wasn't expansion, it was signaling small, sharp acts meant to remind black communities that progress had limits. Most of these networks left no public record. What existed appeared later buried in internal memos, scattered interviews, and reports that stopped short of conclusions. According to retired officers who spoke years later, the absence of paperwork wasn't accidental. It was policy by neglect. Thomas fit a specific profile. He wasn't targeted because he was weak. He was targeted because he represented something harder to intimidate: upward movement without apology. Education, confidence, the promise of courtrooms instead of streets. For men invested in hierarchy, that promise was a threat. The note pinned to his chest wasn't written for him. It was written for Harlem. It said that degrees didn't matter, that manners didn't matter, that the city's north side was not immune. The message relied on history to do the rest of the work. In precinct offices, detectives discussed the case in lowered voices. No one argued that Thomas had done anything to invite his death. The question wasn't guilt, it was response. Pursuing the truth would mean acknowledging an organized presence the city preferred to deny. And denial was easier. The system Thomas trusted had made him visible: school records, student IDs, public routines. It had also failed to shield him when visibility became dangerous. There was no alert, no patrol adjustment, no warning. Only paperwork that moved quickly once the body was found. When the report labeled his death a suicide, it erased more than cause. It erased intent, planning, and the fact that someone had watched a young man long enough to know exactly when to take him. That erasure was quiet, efficient, and permanent. Thomas Johnson wanted to become a lawyer because he believed justice lived in systems strong enough to defend the innocent. In 1946, Harlem, the system didn't just fail to protect him, it pretended he had never been targeted at all. The call came just after 7:12 a.m. No recording exists of it. No transcript. What survives is the shape it left behind: Illinois. Gordon reached Bumpy Johnson at his office while Harlem was still waking up. The city outside moved the way it always did: delivery trucks, idling shop gates, lifting radios, warming to life. Inside the room, the air went still. Gordon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said the name first, then the location, then nothing at all. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Gordon finished, there was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. "How?" Bumpy asked, and the word landed flat, emptied of emotion. Gordon hesitated. "They're saying suicide," he said. There was another pause, but there was a note. Bumpy ended the call without a goodbye. He stayed seated for several minutes, unmoving, as if motion would turn the words into something permanent. Outside his window, Harlem continued uninterrupted. Men walked to work. Children were pulled along by mothers late for school. The city had already decided it could keep going. The contrast was immediate and cruel. Private grief arrived in a place that did not slow down for it. Bumpy put on his coat and left the office without comment, stepping into a street that did not yet know what had happened in its park. Ruth Johnson lived 4 blocks away. When Bumpy entered her apartment, the room was full, but silent, crowded with neighbors who had come because they didn't know what else to do. Ruth sat on the couch, hands folded, eyes red and fixed on a point that wasn't there. She looked up when she saw him and didn't ask questions. "They took my baby," she said. The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Bumpy sat beside her. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't correct the word suicide or repeat what he had been told. He held her hand and let the quiet do its work. Helplessness settled in, unfamiliar and unwelcome. For a man used to leverage, there was none to reach for. Ruth spoke again. They said he did it to himself. Her voice shook not with doubt but with refusal. Thomas wouldn't. Bumpy nodded. He didn't argue the point because it wasn't an argument. It was fact. Outside the city kept pace. Radios reported traffic. Newspapers went to print without this story. Somewhere a clerk stamped a form and moved on to the next file. The machinery of normal life ran smoothly indifferent to the room where a mother sat hollowed out by loss. After the neighbors drifted away, Ruth looked at Bumpy. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a simple question with no acceptable answer. Bumpy didn't promise outcomes. He didn't outline plans. He understood that speaking publicly would change the shape of everything, turn grief into spectacle, invite attention that would not protect anyone. Silence for the moment was not surrender. It was containment. "I'm going to handle this," he said quietly. Ruth searched his face. "Will it bring him back?" "No." Then why the question wasn't defiance? It was exhaustion. Because if nothing happens, Bumpy said, this happens again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say names. He didn't need to. The weight of the words did the work. Ruth nodded once. She understood what silence could mean when words failed. "Make them understand," she said. Not as a demand, as a plea. Later that morning, Bumpy stood beneath the oak tree in Marcus Garvey Park. The rope was gone, the body removed. The space looked ordinary again, which made it worse. He didn't search like a policeman. He observed like someone who knew what mattered. Cigarette butts crushed together. Overlapping shoe prints. A button torn loose. Small things left behind because no one believed they would be collected. There is no record of that visit. No log entry. What remains is the result. The call that morning was never documented, but everyone involved remembered it. Not for what was said, but for what was decided not to be said aloud. By the time the sun climbed over the rooftops, Marcus Garvey Park looked ordinary again. The rope was gone. The body had been removed. Officers had walked the perimeter once long enough to say they had been there short enough to leave nothing disturbed that mattered. On paper, the scene was clean. In reality, it had only been tidied. Bumpy Johnson returned to the park late that morning alone. He didn't approach it like a crime scene. He approached it like a place where something had gone wrong and been abandoned too quickly. He stood beneath the oak tree and waited, letting his eyes adjust to what had been overlooked. The grass beneath the branch was flattened in several directions, not straight down. Shoes had shifted. Weight had moved. This wasn't the mark of one man standing alone. It was the footprint of a group that had waited, paced, and repositioned themselves. Someone had been nervous. Someone had been impatient. Near the base of the tree were cigarette butts, 5 of them pressed into the dirt close together. Not scattered, not casual, different brands. Smoked down to the filter as if time had been spent killing minutes before something scheduled arrived. They hadn't been bagged. They hadn't been photographed. They didn't appear in any report. A few feet away, half hidden in the grass, was a torn button. Dark blue. Industrial stitching. The kind used on work uniforms, not coats bought for church. It hadn't fallen gently. It had been ripped free. Bumpy memorized where it lay, but didn't pick it up. Evidence wasn't about possession. It was about understanding what it meant. Nearby shoe prints overlapped in the soil, heavy tread-work boots, the kind worn by men who spent their days on concrete floors. Mechanics, factory workers, men who clocked out and went home looking unremarkable. The police had missed all of it or chosen not to see it. According to official files, none of these details existed. Bumpy widened his circle walking the paths that led in and out of the park. Whoever did this hadn't rushed. They had arrived early and left without panic. That required confidence. Confidence usually comes from believing no one will ask questions. At the north entrance, he noticed a man sitting on a bench-thin coat pulled tight despite the mild weather. Curtis had slept there for years. People walked past him daily without learning his name. That invisibility was its own kind of camouflage. Bumpy sat down beside him, not too close, not too far. Curtis stiffened. He knew who this was. Everyone did. "You see anything this morning?" Bumpy asked voice level. Curtis hesitated, eyes scanning the park as if it might still be listening. "I don't want trouble," he said. "You won't get it," Bumpy replied. "You'll get left alone." That promise carried weight. Curtis leaned in slightly. 5 white men, he said, came before sunrise, sat by the tree, smoking, laughing. He swallowed. They said they were teaching someone a lesson. Names were harder. Curtis hadn't heard all of them, but one stuck. "Danny," he said. The others called him Danny. He also remembered where they said they were going afterward. A tavern east of Harlem. A place where they felt comfortable being loud. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He didn't ask Curtis to repeat himself. He didn't write anything down. When Curtis finished, Bumpy handed him money folded small enough to disappear into a pocket. "You weren't here," Bumpy said. Curtis nodded and left without looking back. Later that afternoon, Bumpy made a phone call to a bartender who owed him favors. He didn't mention the park. He didn't mention a body. He asked a simple question about a group of men who had been celebrating too early in the morning. Names came back quickly. Too quickly. 5 of them. Regulars. Met every other Friday. Used the back room. Quiet about what they were, loud about what they believed. None of this appeared in any police file. There were no supplemental reports, no follow-up interviews, no canvases notes. The evidence existed only in memory, in the margins, in the spaces where official attention refused to linger. By nightfall, Bumpy had more than suspicion. He had patterns, routines, addresses. He hadn't touched the law, and the law hadn't touched this case. The park went dark again, ordinary once more, but the evidence hadn't disappeared. It had simply been left for someone else to collect. By the end of the first day, the names were fixed. 5 of them. Not aliases, not rumors. Real men with addresses, routines, and jobs that paid by the hour. The list didn't come from a single source. It assembled itself the way reliable truths often do, through repetition. Different voices, same details. That consistency mattered more than paperwork. Each name came with a pattern. One worked mornings at an auto shop in the Bronx, clocking in before 8, staying late when business was slow. Another ran a press at a factory off the river, the kind of job that coated hands in grease and left boots heavy with dust. 100 on weekends drove north when pressure mounted. None of them lived like fugitives. They lived like men who believed no one would come looking. The 7-day clock didn't start with a meeting or an order. It started with observation. Cars were followed without tailing. Schedules were confirmed without questions. Groceries bought on the same nights. Bars visited at the same hours. Routines repeated because repetition feels safe. Safety breeds carelessness. Day 2 confirmed work routes. Day 3 mapped homes. Day 4 filled in families. Neighbors' habits that never changed. Who smoked, who drank, who locked doors, who didn't. Information accumulated quietly like sediment. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. The objective was never noise. Noise invites attention, and attention invites mistakes. The objective was recognition, making sure each man understood at the precise moment required that he had been seen. Not chased. Seen. By day 5, the awareness began to show. One of them lingered longer at his shop, scanning the street before closing up. Another stopped going to his usual bar, choosing a place farther away, less familiar. A third checked his mirrors too often while driving. None of them spoke to police. None of them filed reports. Fear has a way of isolating people before it drives them to authority. There is no document that records the order in which things unfolded. No logbook, no timestamps verified by the state. What exists are outcomes that align too cleanly to be coincidence. According to those who watched from the edges, the men began to change in sequence, not together. That mattered. It suggested they were being handled individually, not collectively. Day 6 was the longest. Waiting always is. It's when doubt creeps in and decisions reveal themselves. One man packed a bag and left town early, choosing distance over denial. Another stayed convinced the first was overreacting. Confidence and fear split the group without a word being exchanged. Day 7 arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no announcements, no warnings delivered publicly. Whatever happened next didn't rely on spectacle. It relied on certainty. Each man understood in his own way that the city knew who he was and where he stood. That knowledge alone altered behavior. This wasn't about punishment yet. It was about pressure, about narrowing choices until they became obvious. When people feel watched, they make mistakes. They talk to the wrong person. They go to familiar places thinking familiarity equals protection. They underestimate how much can be learned without a single confrontation. By nightfall, 5 names had turned into 5 sets of consequences waiting to happen. The network around them, friends, coworkers, meeting places, had been mapped and weighed. Not all of it would matter. Only the parts that proved how exposed they were. No legal record confirms the sequence. No court ever examined the process. What survived were the results and the memory of a week when 5 men learned the same lesson at different speeds. Invisibility is an illusion once someone decides to look. In Harlem, the countdown didn't announce itself. It simply moved forward one day at a time until everyone involved understood that silence had already chosen sides. No announcement was made, no statement issued. Nothing appeared in print that connected what began to happen next. That was the point. The first incident was reported as isolated, a personal matter according to those who heard it described later. No press followed, no official comment clarified what it meant. By the time the second incident surfaced, the pattern was already forming, but only among people who knew how to read silence. Rumors moved faster than newspapers ever could. They traveled through barbershops, back rooms, loading docks, and church basements. They didn't arrive as stories. They arrived as warnings delivered in fragments. A name mentioned, then dropped. A place avoided. A sentence cut short before it needed explanation. By midweek, men who had never met each other were changing routines for the same reason. Cars took different streets. Doors stayed locked during daylight hours. Conversations ended early. The message didn't need repetition. It only needed confirmation. Police heard the rumors too. They always did. But they didn't chase them. According to officers who later spoke in retirement, this wasn't neglect. It was calculation. Each event viewed alone didn't justify escalation. A fire here, an injury there, a disappearance that could be explained away with paperwork and patience. What mattered was what never happened. No task force was assembled. No press conference promised transparency. No detectives knocked on doors after dark. The city's response was deliberate restraint disguised as routine. According to internal practice at the time, incidents unlinked on paper remained unlinked in action. By the 4th day, the absence of enforcement became its own signal. People noticed which cases moved and which stalled, which reports were followed up and which were quietly filed. The police weren't overwhelmed. They were choosing distance. That choice spoke louder than any statement ever could. The rumors sharpened. Details changed depending on who told them, but the conclusion stayed the same. Someone had crossed a line. Someone else had responded. The how mattered less than the certainty that it had happened and would happen again if necessary. Men who shared meetings began canceling them without explanation. A regular gathering spot closed early one night and never reopened. Supplies were moved, records destroyed. Things that took years to build unraveled in days, not because of raids, but because confidence evaporated. The press lagged behind, constrained by what could be verified. Editors hesitated. Without official linkage, stories stayed small, buried in columns that didn't ask readers to connect dots. The city appeared calm on the surface. That calm was misleading. Behind it, behavior shifted. Police patrols adjusted routes, subtly avoiding places where attention would imply involvement. Officers were instructed quietly to observe and report, but not engage. According to later recollections, the directive was never written down. It didn't need to be. Everyone understood the boundaries. This wasn't corruption in the obvious sense, it was risk management. No one wanted to be responsible for escalating something they believed would resolve itself. And resolution in this case didn't require arrests. It required cessation. By the end of the week, the rumors slowed not because they were disproven, but because they had done their work. People stopped asking questions. The questions had answers already, even if none were spoken aloud. The message had spread without a speech, without a single public demand. It traveled through absence of police action, of press urgency, of official curiosity. Each omission reinforced the last. According to records that survived, the incidents remained separate. Fires were fires, injuries were accidents, departures were personal choices. No file ever tied them together. But Harlem did. And so did the men who understood that sometimes the most effective warning is the one delivered quietly, confirmed privately, and never acknowledged by the people who have the authority to stop it. The meeting was not announced. No flyers, no phone trees, no written notices. It happened the way such meetings always did, through habits that assumed safety. A familiar warehouse, a familiar hour. Men arriving alone or in pairs, careful not to be seen together for too long. There is no record of who called it. No minutes, no roll call. What exists are outcomes that point backward to a room where decisions were forced by circumstance rather than leadership. By that night, the pressure had done its work. The group was no longer unified by purpose. It was split by fear. Some had already stopped showing up to regular gatherings. Others insisted absence was weakness, that backing down would invite more trouble. The room filled unevenly, voices louder than usual, patience thinner. Those who wanted to leave spoke first. They argued pragmatism, not principle. The city had changed. Harlem had changed. Whatever protection and visibility once offered was gone. Staying meant exposure. Leaving meant survival. Their words weren't brave, but they were measured. The others answered with certainty. Certainty has always been a shield. They dismissed the incidents as coincidence, the rumors as exaggeration. To them, acknowledging risk meant admitting vulnerability. And vulnerability in that room was treated as betrayal. The debate didn't follow rules. It rose and fell in bursts, overlapping arguments colliding without resolution. Names were mentioned and immediately withdrawn. Places were referenced without detail. Everyone understood the boundaries of what could be said aloud. At some point, the conversation turned to the police, not as protectors, but as variables. Would law enforcement intervene if things escalated? Would attention force accountability? The question hung in the air longer than any answer. The silence that followed said more than words. By then it was clear that the police were not coming. Not that night, not for this. The absence of intervention had already been observed, tested, and confirmed. Whatever line had existed was no longer where it used to be. That realization fractured the room. A vote was taken, though no one later agreed on how formal it was. Hands raised, heads counted. The result was decisive enough to end the argument, but not strong enough to erase doubt. A minority chose to leave immediately. They didn't argue further. They didn't look back. They walked out with what they could carry and the understanding that departure was permanent. Those who stayed convinced themselves that staying was strength, that the city would not allow matters to go further, that attention, if it came, would arrive in time. They mistook inertia for protection. Outside, the night held. No patrol cars slowed. No radios crackled. The warehouse remained just another building on a dark street, unremarkable to anyone passing by. The law did not appear, and in its absence, assumptions hardened into decisions. The climax of the night was not an arrest. It was not a raid. It was not a confrontation with authority that could be documented or challenged. The defining moment was what failed to occur. No intervention, no warning, no signal that the state intended to step in. According to later accounts, that absence settled the matter more decisively than any argument inside the room. Those who remained had chosen a path without realizing how narrow it had become. Those who left understood that survival depended on distance, not defiance. By morning, the meeting was already being retold inaccurately. Numbers changed, voices were exaggerated, but the outcome stayed consistent across every version. After that night, the group no longer functioned as a unit. Decisions were no longer collective. Trust was gone. There is no document that confirms the meeting took place. No report that acknowledges a vote. What survives is the sudden collapse that followed a network that stopped meeting, stopped coordinating, stopped existing in any meaningful way. The night ended everything not because of what happened inside the warehouse, but because the law chose not to enter it. And once that choice became clear, there was nothing left to debate. After that week, the activity stopped. Not slowed, not reduced, it ended. According to city records reviewed years later, there were no further reports tied to the group. No meetings flagged, no intercepted communications. No surveillance notes suggesting reorganization. Whatever structure had existed before September 1946 did not adapt or relocate. It vanished. There was no victory announced, no acknowledgement from authorities that a threat had been neutralized. The absence itself became the statistic. 1 week of escalation followed by years of nothing. Police precinct logs show normal operations resumed almost immediately. Patrol routes returned to standard rotation. No additional resources were allocated. Internally, the matter was treated as resolved, not because it had been solved, but because it no longer demanded attention. Silence once again did the work. The funeral took place 3 days later at Abyssinian Baptist Church. More than 3,000 people attended. The casket was closed. Ruth Johnson insisted on it. She did not want the city remembering her son as he had been found. She wanted them to remember the boy who studied late, who walked the same route every Sunday, who believed in courtrooms and rules. Bumpy Johnson stood beside his sister throughout the service. He did not speak. He did not gesture. Those who knew him understood that the stillness was intentional. Nothing needed to be said publicly. Everything that mattered had already been communicated elsewhere. Outside the church, Harlem gathered without spectacle. There were no chants, no marches, no confrontations with police. Just numbers. Presence. A community marking a boundary without drawing a line. After the burial, the stories changed tone. Early whispers of fear were replaced by something quieter. Certainty. People stopped asking whether it could happen again. The question no longer felt relevant. The answer had been delivered without explanation. Over the following months, familiar faces disappeared from certain neighborhoods. A few men moved west. Others changed jobs. Some simply stopped being mentioned at all. There were no missing person reports tied to the shift. No investigations reopened. Nothing that required a conclusion. Journalists who tried to revisit the case years later found only fragments. Reports that ended abruptly. Notes that referenced other notes no longer on file. Officers who declined interviews or spoke only in generalities. No one contradicted the official version. No one expanded on it either. The lack of contradiction became its own confirmation. By the early 1950s, even rumors faded. New generations heard the story secondhand, stripped of detail but heavy with implication. The specifics didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the outcome. Certain acts no longer occurred. Certain threats were no longer made. The city did not credit itself. There were no press releases citing successful deterrence, no statistics celebrating prevention. That would have required admitting what had been prevented. Instead, there was a prolonged quiet. According to retired officers who spoke decades later, the file was never formally reopened because there was nothing to attach it to. No suspects in custody. No charges pending. No incidents demanding linkage. In procedural terms, the case was complete. In practical terms, it was unfinished in a way that discouraged revisiting. For Harlem, the lesson was understood without being articulated. There are lines that once crossed do not invite negotiation. There are moments when the absence of response from authority is not weakness, but withdrawal. And withdrawal leaves space for other forces to define order. Thomas Johnson's name did not appear again in official records after the burial notice. His ambitions were not fulfilled. His future was never tested. But his death altered behavior in ways that no statute or injunction ever could. No one ever issued a statement explaining why the violence stopped. No agency took responsibility. No conclusion was offered. Only years of continued absence of threats of symbols of organized presence. That silence lasted. And in a city where noise usually follows blood, the quiet became the final evidence. After that, nothing came back. No trial ever followed. No verdict was issued, no indictment filed, and no investigation reopened. The file closed quietly stamped and archived while the city kept moving forward. Nothing on record ever explained why it ended there. But Harlem changed. Not because of speeches or headlines, but because something never happened again. After 1946, that kind of terror did not return. Silence itself became the boundary no one dared cross. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a lawyer. The law failed him, and it never answered for his death. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Like the video, share it, and subscribe to uncover more buried files. When the law looks away, was this justice or power choosing a different ending?